Hello. Our story begins inside the Mandalorian throne room, inside the capital of Sundari. With the help of Crimson Dawn, the prideful Mandalorian leader had fallen victim to a heinous plot. Now sat the moment of truth. Now sat the reality Maul had been dreaming for eons. All of his life's work amounted to nothing because of Kenobi, and here, he finally found his chance to take his revenge. Maul's initial plan was to betray Vizsla so that the Mandalorian pawn could never have satisfaction in Satine's death. But the Sith Lord, the leader of this criminal syndicate, had but one wish: to harm Obi Wan Kenobi. That therein lay the problem though. Obi Wan was a simple Jedi. His reliance to the code wouldn't give Maul any true sense of satisfaction. This death, though one of Satine, was meant to inflict deep emotional pain. But as he sat in her throne, with the Duchess next to him, he realized that all of what he wanted didn't exist. Because the change, the death, the pain, and anguish he wanted Obi-Wan to endure wouldn't. Killing Satine would be a dent in his armor, a large one albeit, but just a dent. Because to Obi-Wan, there was nothing more important than the Jedi Code. Maul knew that the Jedi would send Kenobi, and he was more than familiar with Obi-Wan's desires to be a voice of righteousness and the law and order of the Jedi and the galaxy. So, if he killed Satine, he was only getting rid of a political puppet that he could use for his own benefit. Duchess Satine had such an influence over the Neutral Systems Coalition that he would have far more value in her capture than he would in her death. Maul wanted Obi-Wan to feel his friend's death, and know he could do nothing to stop it. But just like Qui-Gon Jinn, the wretched Jedi Master he killed on Naboo, it wouldn't stop Obi-Wan from remaining loyal to the code itself. Maul tapped his metallic toes eagerly, as these thoughts rampantly ran through his mind. If he wanted to truly find his sense of victory, he needed to take it. Kenobi would continue to haunt him no matter what. If he were freed by some miracles, chance after killing Satine, then what would change for Obi-Wan? Nothing. He would continue remaining rent-free inside of Maul's mind until the end of his own life, and that burden was one he did not want to live with. Instead, he planned on making Obi-Wan's death emotionally burdening, and then filled with nothing. When Kenobi was brought into the throne room, Maul did his little spiel, the one he had reversed quietly inside of his mind until Obi-Wan's arrival. He did the same whole trick, choking Satine by lifting her off the ground with the Force, and he watched Obi-Wan's certainty in the Jedi path. This only affirmed Maul's desire to kill Kenobi. Doing this to Satine wouldn't add any benefit to his own life, and so as he ignited the Darksaber, he watched Obi-Wan panic, rushing to his feet, only to be shoved down by two inept guards. Just as he looked up, he felt a rising pain. Satine fell to the ground and started heaving, after losing her ability to breathe for far more than a minute. Her eyes looked up, and Maul's arm was outstretched. She followed the trail until it landed on Obi-Wan, who wore shock in his eyes. He looked down. The Darksaber was protruding from his abdomen. He couldn't believe it. Maul smiled to himself as he watched the life slowly leave Obi-Wan's body. It was the perfect strike. A saber gash that went straight through the abdomen and out through the spinal cord. Maul admired his throwing skills, because it was the exact same strike that took Qui-Gon's life. He watched Satine slip down the stairs and to Obi-Wan's side, where she grabbed him and held him up in her arms. Tears fled her eyes, as did a singular tear leave Obi-Wan's, as she asked that he not go, that he stay for just another minute. He held her hand and felt the moment pass by, like a flash of memories dissipating under the radiance of a heavenly storm. His mind lost focus, and then he found just the two of them. There was no one else, just them. He would have much rather this been him than her. She just wished that there was more time for them, as she confessed that her love had always been for him. He told her that the time was hers to have, but until that time goes, his heart would forever be hers to keep. The grip of his hand slowly loosened, and he started to drift backwards ever so slowly. Satine's sobs grew quieter, as if a part of her life had died off with him. Obi-Wan's pulse ran cold, and she felt his limp hand in hers, as she raised it slowly to her mouth and kissed it gently, before placing it on Obi-Wan's body as he lay silently. He was now one with the Force. Savage asked Maul what they would do with the Duchess, and he simply responded with political manipulation, telling the guards to take the Duchess to her cell. She was lifted off the ground and pulled away from Obi-Wan. The first few steps she was dragged until she slowly found her feet with each passing second. All of her sorrow was consumed with a rage she had not felt since Mandalore's civil war. the one that took her father's life, when she was nothing but a young teen. There was fire in her eyes, and she felt heat rising from her body, like a volcano ready to burst, but she closed her eyes and allowed the 2 Death Watch guards to be her guide. Her mind was focused on that one moment. She did have all the time, but now Maul would have to pay. She dedicated her life to peace because she had seen what war had done. But she was going to show Maul what true suffering was, because under all of her pacifist ways defined by the trauma of loss was a true Mandalorian, one that was destined to lead her people and one who had just fundamentally been betrayed by every single one of them. She would show Maul and Savage what a true Mandalorian was, because she knew that if it had been her, Obi Wan would have done something. He had the power to. He would have saved her. The entire moment became slightly blurry because of the loss of air to her lungs, which did drastically affect her head for a few short moments. But now, with full consciousness coming back and control coming to her mind, she knew what she wanted. Though sadly, her belief that Obi Wan would have used his powers for good were wrong. His opportunity to do literally anything had passed, and he paid with his life for it. Before Satine could be placed into prison, she was freed by her sister. Bo-Katan was so relieved to see that she had survived. After Bo took down the few guards, she removed her helmet. As she did, Satine grabbed a pistol from one of the fallen Death Watch members and shoved her forearm against her sister's throat and pushed her against the railing as she planted the barrel of the pistol against Bo's head. There was fire in Satine's eyes, and she demanded to know what Bo could have possibly gained from doing this to Mandalore. What could she gain from betraying her father, her sister, her people? Satine's voice continued to crack and burn with intensity. Bo was shocked. Satine had always been kind and compassionate towards her, even when they were little. This was intense, and unlike her sister. Satine demanded an answer though, as Bo looked at her sister with terror in her eyes. She felt like a child. She felt so helpless despite all of her skill and despite her night out surrounding them. Satine whipped the pistol away and tossed it over the edge as she ripped a jetpack off of one of the Death Watch members. She told Bo to get her to Kalevala. She'd deal with her immature outburst later. Bo watched Satine shove the backpack onto a Mandalorian chestplate she was given before lunging off the platform and heading towards the landing docks. Satine saw Mandalore at civil war once more, and it broke her heart. But she left the planet and returned to her home world, a distant moon of Mandalore. Despite the pain she was in, her first intention was to contact a friend. She had no intention of bringing him or the Republic to Mandalore, and she made that extremely clear. The message Satine sent to Anakin, which was received immediately, informed him of Obi-Wan's death, and her almost death at the hands of Maul. However, she asked that Anakin do not come to Mandalore, per her official request, because this had become an eternal matter, one that had gone far enough. She wished him well and sent her love. It was short, to the point, and riddled with her suffering. Bo-Katan was also inside of her home, Castle Kryze, with her sister, but she almost feared coming face to face with Satine again. All she knew is her older sibling was digging for something. On Coruscant, Skywalker sat in silence. His best friend was gone, and he couldn't do anything. He should have gone. He should have been there. He and Ahsoka were preparing to head to Cato Nemodia to finish a campaign, and he didn't think he'd have the strength to do it. He sat inside of his room, fleshing out his emotions for several hours. Satine's calm demeanor was the last of it she had, and she forced her rage into her body and mind so that Anakin had a more comforting message, one to not entice him to seek revenge, the same revenge that she was currently setting out to do. He wanted to find and kill Maul with his bare hands, and little did he know that he was unable to because Sidious had already killed Savage and taken Maul as prisoner. When Anakin rallied his thoughts and emotions, he decided that it was time to address the High Council. They needed to know about this development immediately. By the time he reached their chambers, it was evening. The council was mostly disbanded. All that remained were the Grand Master, Master of the Order, and 2 others, one being the current bookkeeper until another came, and the last being the overseer of operations on Kamino. Yoda, Mace, Strass Ali, and Shakti sat silently watching Anakin's movements as he relayed the information to them. They looked to each other before Yoda informed Anakin that they had already been made aware. They were also informed by Duchess Satine that she had already reached out to Anakin before ever informing them. They looked somberly to each other. Mace spoke expressively, telling Anakin that he had a great master, a genuine Jedi who understood what it took to master the arts of the Force and the saber, and above all else knew how to be a good friend. Anakin's eyes watered a little, as fury started to arise once again. He looked to them and asked what they could do about it. And they said they'd do nothing. As the Duchess expressed, she desired to remain in control of the situation. Anakin made an argument, as he would, and it was denied, because the Jedi could not risk interfering with the Republic treaties that had been set in place. They were stuck here. However, there was something the Council wished to speak to Skywalker about, which was Obi Wan's final wish. Something the Council frequently did was obey the final wishes of masters who had passed on. Master Plo was on the Council because of his teacher, Tyvoka, for an example. Mace explained that Obi-Wan informed the Council, specifically himself and Yoda, that if Obi-Wan fell, he wanted Anakin to take his place. Regardless of his age, time as a knight, time as a master, all that mattered was it was his only wish, because he wanted Anakin to have success as a Jedi, and he believed that this would be the most efficient way for Anakin to find it. Obi-Wan never told Anakin of this wish because he didn't want the knowledge of this potential ascension to get to his head. Anakin stood in silence for a moment, as Mace looked to Yoda and then back to Anakin, informing him that the Council stood by Master Kenobi's wishes. They were offering him a chance to join them, as the youngest member to join their body in the history of the Order. Anakin looked to each of them and accepted their decision with great honor. Truthfully speaking, he couldn't have picked a better time. Not more than a full day after Anakin left Coruscant, the Jedi Temple would be bombed. On Kalevala, during Anakin's ascension to the High Council and the beginning of the Jedi Temple bombing investigation, Satine Kryze was preparing her own mission. She had been searching through her father's collection, because despite her desire to remain a pacifist, her life didn't start off like that. Both she and her sister traditionally went to the living waters beneath Sundari. This was obviously done for ritualistic purposes, something to signify the tradition of the Mandalorian way. Satine had long forgotten her warrior path, and the training she had received from her father as a child. The two of them had a great relationship, and she did with her mother as well, but much of that had been long forgotten due to her mother dying early into her life. Satine's pain would fuel her decision to reclaim Mandalore. She was very cold to Bo, despite her younger sister trying to make amends, though there was something Bo needed to realize. If she had done anything to notify her sister about this coming attack, they could have prepared, and she didn't. Bo almost indirectly killed her sister and plunged Mandalore into another civil war. A war that, like the first one they faced, tore their family apart. Bo knew Satine had every right to be upset at her, but it didn't take away the burden of pain of such frustration and anger. They were completely separated physically, and isolated emotionally. Bo stood on the landing platform of her castle, and watched the seas below her twist and knot. Inside the castle, Satine held her armor close to her chest and didn't know what to do. It was created in the Great Forge, as a ceremonial piece. She had one inside the Sundari Palace as well, but this one was from a younger age of her childhood, at least the helmet. The other pieces of her armor were used for the adult variant. She didn't have tears to release, she didn't have anger to externalize, she was just tired. Satine above anyone else knew that this was a political move by Vizsla, and she was so disheartened that her people would willingly believe an active terrorist, one who had incited violence before. They were vile people, and Mandalore would pay the price for the decision, but as their leader, that was going to change. She placed the helmet down and walked over to her father's suit, wiping dust off the chest plate and sizing it up. Satine was a lot like her father, as a leader, as a warrior, and as a peacekeeper. These similarities continued through their physical appearance. She was close to his height, if not the same height as him. She didn't really know, but at the very least, the armor might be something she could wear, with some slight modifications. She knew that her dad wouldn't mind if she retrofitted it to do the right thing. She grabbed the armor and placed it over her body. There were some loose ends that she made note of, especially in the helmet, but all of that could be changed. Her father had several books on the Mandalorian traditions, operating forges, and the warrior way. She would use them, she would learn from them, and she would have her revenge. Though she would pass out from pure exhaustion after being awake for more than 36 hours. Bo would find Satine creased across a chair, with her hand holding her head up, and dozens of books surrounding her. Bo wanted to do something, but decided not to, because she didn't want to upset her sister, which unironically is the opposite of what her actions would have been interpreted as. On Coruscant, Counselor Skywalker, who is technically a master due to currently instructing a student, refused to vote to force Ahsoka out of the Order. Anakin knew for a fact that it was impossible for Ahsoka to have been the culprit of the bombing. Despite the evidence against her being damning as could be, there was something else, something deeper involved here. Anakin told the Council, and especially Tarkin, that they would need less than a week to confirm these suspicions. If he was proved wrong, Anakin's gaze shifted towards the rest of the Council, then he would step down from his seat and bear Ahsoka's punishment himself. Tarkin scoffed at such a prideful warrior, relinquishing his raw battle prowess to be such a tool for the Jedi. Their code was a flaw, and it was a shame individuals as talented as Skywalker remained controlled by it. The Council was at odds with this. The issue is, Ahsoka was in a predicament that made her look guilty above all else. She was in a cell with the only culprit and choked her out. Tragically, Commander Fox decided to not lock the facility down and play a game of Among Us, so they were stuck in this predicament. Anakin wanted to lead this investigation, and the Jedi decided to trust his judgment. He knew Ahsoka best, and while the war brought out the worst in those around them, it was true that as her instructor, it would be best to trust his knowledge of his student. They were around each other the most leading up to the bombing, so he should know. The whole scenario felt so weird. It felt like a setup, which led Anakin to telling the Jedi that they needed to start with Commander Fox and the Republic military building. Mace looked to Yoda before turning back. Everyone was a little on edge. Yoda knew what it was like to have a Jedi student fall to the dark side, and he was paranoid that another Jedi from his own lineage had done the same thing. After all, Dooku was Qui-Gon's teacher, and he was Obi Wan's, leading to Anakin and Ahsoka, so it very well could be a cursed lineage, especially due to Obi Wan and Qui-Gon having died. But even with this lineage issue, Mace told Anakin to gather together knights and investigators and move quickly. Tarkin was especially close to the Chancellor, and this move was likely from Palpatine's office. This made Anakin's skin crawl. He and the Council hadn't had the time to make Palpatine aware of Anakin's transition to the Council. Anakin almost did, but he couldn't because he had to leave for the Kid Nemodian campaign. This in Anakin's mind was a betrayal, because if he wasn't on the Council, he wouldn't have known that Ahsoka's life was actually in Palpatine's hands. He knew everything looked bad, but they had spoken about his student numerous times. Palpatine should have known that she was a better person than that. It truly did hurt his heart, though, knowing that his friend would just turn his back on him, even after being a mentor of sorts, which definitely put the burden on the whole losing Obi Wan thing, and having a mentor that wasn't as trustworthy as he seemed. When Satine woke up, her hand was numb, and she had to shake out the pins and needles before getting back to her reading. There wasn't much food inside the castle, but their servant droids had already prepared her food, which she ate very little of. Bo tried to speak to her sister, but again, decided not to. She was truthfully afraid of Satine, because in one moment, with her back against the wall, with everything she spent a lifetime working on the cusp of destruction, she was fueled with the terror of becoming prey, and Satine became predator. Nothing about this dynamic was easy, nor would it remain easy, but the truth is, at the end of all of it, Satine was going to fight for Mandalore with her life. She read through the books and started training. Being that this was indeed a castle, there was a training room with training droids and she got to work. Everything was really rusty for her, but after every future bruise, after every open bleeding cut, after every single time she got knocked down, she got back up. Bo happened to be walking by when she saw Satine training for the first time since they were little girls. It hurt her, knowing that she had caused this to her sister. Bo exited the doorway before Satine could see her, but Satine felt that she was being watched. Bo knew her sister, at least what drove her, and it was always the betterment of Mandalore. After several hours, Satine was sore, but she continued going, forcing herself to continue until complete collapse. She would again be found by her younger sister, who this time decided to move her to another room so that she could actually sleep in a bed. But Bo would not remain inside the castle afterwards. She decided to remove herself from the premises and begin to work on her own hunt for Darth Maul. No one had seen him, but Mandalore was once again engulfed in civil war, and she felt the burden of responsibility. Bo would try and rectify her mistakes surrounding the fall of Mandalorian peace, prosperity, and society. On Coruscant, Anakin's investigation would take himself and a number of Jedi Knights into the Republic military complex to try and find the culprit. What they had found was a lightsaber gash in one of the vents. It seemed that Pressed with the pressure of stopping Ahsoka from gaining the truth, an individual was forced to use a lightsaber to get into the area of the building so that she had access to the cell. This automatically proved that Ahsoka couldn't have been behind this. The Jedi investigators with Anakin had cameras attached to their robes, just in case something like this came up, so that they couldn't be found as faking an investigation. This alone proved that Ahsoka wasn't behind the bombing. However, this did narrow down their search. No one knew Asajj Ventress was on planet, so she wasn't a possible target. Their only foe could and would be a Jedi, unless the mysterious Sidious figure was behind it. Though there was something else important to note. The culprit behind the case had to be very small, and they had to know that Ahsoka was going further into her investigation by traveling here to meet with Letta. This led to a thorough discussion with Ahsoka where she revealed the number of Jedi and individuals outside the Jedi Order that she interacted with before coming here. The individuals she had spoken to or talked with were given over, and the investigation quickly carried on. Anakin happened to be the one who interrogated Barriss because they were friends, a conversation that would eventually spiral out of control into a tense standoff, one that Skywalker would claim victory in, and one that would further prove his decision and his worthiness of remaining a member of the Council. The minds of the High Council itself would see this as Ahsoka's greatest trial, and she, due to not having been forced from the Jedi Order or even knowing about the decision placed in front of them, would remain a member, becoming a knight for her patience, strength, and understanding. Anakin, on the other hand, would become an outright Jedi Master, the youngest one to be accepted into the ranks of the Council. This honor brought him great peace, and while the death of Obi Wan loomed heavily over him, it was this trial, this investigation, that took his mind away from such a painful piece of his life. Following the hunt for the true culprit behind the temple bombing, Skywalker would begin his own deep dive into his emotions. Because Kenobi had passed on, he believed fully in his heart of hearts that Obi-Wan would have chosen Ahsoka like he did. Due to this belief in the trial for Ahsoka, Skywalker felt great distrust for Palpatine. He wasn't pleased with the Council for the decision to consider removing Ahsoka from the Order, but he was present when Tarkin talked. He understood, as his peers did, that Tarkin and Palpatine were long-established friends. Anything Tarkin heard would be in Palpatine's ears. This move came from a deeper place than just Tarkin's own biases against the Jedi Order. Anakin took this very personally, and prepared for his own counter-move. He was still undecided if he would include the Council in it or not. The same went for his desire to destroy Maul. In the Mandalore system, Bo-Katan led her own dwindling squad of Night Owls against the overbearing force of Maul's remaining Death Watch members and Crimson Dawn. Bo had no clue that Maul and the Darksaber had been removed from Mandalore, so for the time being, she and her troops would fight their former allies for control over Sundari. The Duchess, in the eyes of the people, had gone missing. Satine would, for the months to come, continue training her heart out. The war for Mandalore over the same time frame would disappear. Those supporting Maul would make a move to save him, one that would be successful, and one that would bring him back to Mandalore, so that he could exert his own rule, one that lasted thanks to Prime Minister Almec. During this same span of time, Satine continued to train on Kalevala. She understood that Maul's greatest gift was the Force. Of course, there was the other side to that, which was him straight up beating Vizsla in a fight. Throughout her training, something continued to bog her down. Her interest in defeating Maul was a topmost priority, as was it her greatest priority to save her people from the Death Watch. She had no contact with her sister during this time. She knew that it was Bo who removed her from the training hall that first night, but she still had no interest in reaching out. Not that she intended to chase revenge on her own flesh and blood, but she couldn't help that her position here inside the castle was more important. She was focused every day on the same reality, one where she held Maul's decapitated head over her people and pride, championing herself as their leader. A vision, a dream she wanted to bring true. It drove her mad, yet the emotional turmoil of Obi-Wan's death and their quick betrayal left her feeling weighed down. Every training session she did, she felt like 1,000,000 pounds were weighing on her. She couldn't move. Sometimes she found herself stuck, with her weapons in her hands and the mental desire to move on, but the emotional weight of her burden wore her down. She couldn't move, she couldn't fight, and it forced her to struggle throughout her training. Eventually, her adolescent muscle memory returned, but in her mind, it was not good enough, and so she removed herself from Kalevala and placed herself in the undercity of Sundari. She decided that in this situation, the right move was the least expected one. She was keeping up on reports from Mandalore, and she knew that Maul wasn't present until he was saved. The people were reacting negatively, but they couldn't do anything because they chose him over her. And even more, the alliances established with the neutral systems were starting to fall apart. Their only saving grace was the hope that Satine might return, but they weren't going to hold their breath, especially with Palpatine looming over them. She, inversely, was living under the city, sneaking up into the main city and leaving the mark of her clan on buildings, while testing out her own skills. She would fist-fight patrols of Mandalorians, blindsiding them, getting into tested engagements with them, and then fighting her way out. This continued on, as she started to draw attention of her citizens and the attention of Maul's elite guard. However, because of this, Bo was never able to call upon any allies to come to Mandalore, this being in part to Ahsoka never leaving the Jedi Order and the fact that she had no one outside of her sister to go to. Mandalore now eagerly waited for the beginning of another conflict. Outside of the system, that had gone dormant due to criminal control, the Clone Wars came to a crashing conclusion. Anakin began his own personal vendetta to understand why Palpatine would want to force Ahsoka from the Order and eventually her death. He initially couldn't believe it, and upon his first conversation he had with Palpatine following the prosecution of Barriss Offee, he found no answers. Palpatine expressed great distaste in the young Jedi's decisions. Skywalker considered asking about Tarkin, but he let it sit, hoping to outthink a master manipulator. And it never worked, because in Palpatine's mind, if he wasn't interested, then it didn't matter. During the same months that Satine was training herself to death so that she could destroy Maul and retake Mandalore, Anakin was finding absolutely nothing. He wanted to figure this out, and it was the only thing keeping him from Mandalore. He continued to try and look for links, and while he did, he started his own dive into information within the restricted section. Anakin only had a limited time to do this, though luckily for him, there were holocrons from the restricted section that he kept inside of his quarters on the campaign. With Ahsoka by his side, everything felt right, and he began to think heavily on the possibility that Palpatine was a better man than he initially believed following the bombing. Anakin continued though, and everything went relatively similarly, until he and Ahsoka encountered Dooku on the Pike homeworld of Obadiah. It would be there where Anakin and Ahsoka would successfully save Silman, and begin a much deeper investigation into the clone trooper program beginning. Dooku would escape, but eventually meet his end on the Invisible Hand. The Clone Wars would come to an end with Kit Fisto defeating General Grievous on Utapau, with the 7th Sky Corps and another detachment of his men having been assigned to him and capturing the Separatist Council. Master Skywalker and his knight would uncover the Sith relics inside of Palpatine's office, and use them as a call to action, one that would result in Palpatine's removal from office and the shutdown of the Republic government. Despite this shutdown, the war had come to a conclusion, and Skywalker started to become hellbent on getting to Mandalore. He had put it aside long enough, and now he couldn't just let it go on. With the war at an end, he would approach his peers on the council regarding his concerns and wait for their approval or denial. On Mandalore, Satine would continue to use guards of the Death Watch as her training regiment. She would fight them every day, and her clan symbol started to sprout up across Sundari. Maul was growing tiresome of this, and sent out heavier enforcers to punish citizens for her actions. Or, in other words, challenge her core values to come and face him head-on. Initially, this started with a mass curfew on the people of the capital, and then it extended outwards in the public harassment. What Maul believed would work ended up backfiring on him, because Satine spent excess time hunting down main patrols. When she first started her attacking patterns, she was picking on 2 or 3 Mandalorians at a time. She did struggle with them throughout those battles, but she used every bruised part of her body as a lesson learned. The body might forget, but the mind never does, and Satine allowed that motto to push her further and further. She felt more alive as she did this, and while she could never mentally condone violence, she was doing this for her people and for Obi Wan. She was a true leader, and while she felt terrible regret over her decision to remain in hiding over the past few months, she knew it would all be worth it at one point or another. Bo and her night owls, who were also stationed inside the city, were assisting Satine, but they didn't know where she was, and could never keep up with her. Unlike the Death Watch members and night owls, Satine knew every grid in the city, like the back of her hand. She was a teenager when she helped rebuild it. She was a young woman when it first started to prosper, and she was a woman when she gave Mandalore life. She had no problem with making sure that this fight would be Maul's last. Despite her wiping out Mandalorian guards, a large part of her target became criminals of Crimson Dawn running the docks. She had total superiority over the landing zones. She was so focused on ensuring she put fear into the mind of her enemy that she continued striking closer and closer to the palace. Maul didn't fear her though. While her display of battle prowess seemingly was far more talented than he initially believed it to be, Maul continued to believe that his control over the palace would make him the constant victor. The crime lord understood that Satine's methods were a fear tactic. How she would continue beyond them was what made him curious. This was the polar opposite move for her, the pacifist duchess of the land. If she was going to be violent, it had to be incalculable. From what Maul understood, she was only ever a pacifist. What he failed to understand was the fact that she was bred through war. Satine continued to evade the Sith crime lord for days, killing his guards and taking whatever weapons she could for herself. When the day came, she went to the palace without a guarded unit. Her resolve was victory. She wasn't concerned with her relationship with Bo. She was here to do damage and claim victory. When she reached the front door, a group of a dozen or so Mandalorian Death Watch loyalists aimed their weapons at her. She removed her helmet and smiled with a sense of insanity, telling them that she was here to challenge Maul for the Darksaber. They looked to each other and laughed, before telling her to come to her execution. Satine firmed her eyes and placed her helmet over her head and followed them in. Unbeknownst to them, they were being watched as they entered the palace. Satine was brought into the throne room, where she found Maul sitting on her actual throne and lounging. He smiled and looked to the guards, asking if they had captured her, and they shook their heads as she stepped out from behind them, telling Maul that she came here on her own accordance. His eyes twisted in curiosity. She explained further that she was here for the Darksaber. He laughed, similar in a manner to the guards before him, and told her that her fate had just been sealed. His lightsaber ignited and she readied herself, pulling out a vibra blade and igniting the shield on her non-dominant hand. Maul raged forward, swinging aggressively at her as she slid under him, stepping up and away. She paced around, feeling her heart rate bounce out of her chest and through her armor. This duel very easily could be lost to him if she lost and got out of control. To Maul, though, this was an indication that his patrols were simply inept guards. She was avoiding combat. Inept guards, or night owls. He swung again, as she used her shield to block it, almost swaying too recklessly to defend it. He laughed to himself again, and thrusted his saber down as it smashed into the ground, and then again it slammed into her armor, which she used to spin away. He asked her if she really thought she could win this. The Mandalorian helmet may have hidden her expression, but he imagined fear. What her expression was quite the opposite. He mocked her, stepping forward lazily, as she nervously stepped away, before again recklessly attacking him, which she parried with relative ease before shoving her back to the ground. Maul turned back, laughing to himself, telling her that she was never going to be a match for him. He raised his lightsaber over his head so that he could end this challenger, and as he did, Satine lowered her wrist, shooting a barrage of many rockets into his torso, throwing him off of his feet and tumbling across the floor. Satine rose up and readied herself once again. Maul got up and wiped ash from his body as he charged the Duchess. She sized him up, getting an idea of what she was actually dealing with, and stepped back, allowing him to use his momentum against himself, as she defended two quick strikes and thrusted her vibra blade deep into his ribs before spinning away. This only enraged him more, forcing his anger to rise as he leapt up into the air over her, and she saw her opportunity, launching her jetpack up to meet him, and instead of going in for contact, she peeled her body back, using some of her recent training to get a good pull, as she lowered her knee and released another round of shots into Maul's body, this time clipping his belt and tossing the Darksaber from his grasp, and throwing him backwards once more. Satine landed firmly after doing a full backflip and looked over, using her grapple to bring the saber into her hand, which she ignited. Maul turned over, realizing what everyone else was clearly realizing at the same time. She had tricked all of them. She gave them the impression that it was Bo-Katan doing all the patrol hunting, giving him the idea that she hadn't ever seen true combat before. Fighting a grown man as a little girl was never easy, and her father was a better man because of it. Maul used his robotic legs to propel himself towards Satine as she braced herself. Much of her training as of recent had been preparing for the saber duel, a fight that, much like the one before it, relied on Maul's ignorance. She tried to lift the saber, betraying that she had no connected energy with the blade itself. She was able to drag the weapon up to defend a strike, which spun her around aggressively, but she was ready, using her jetpack thrusters to burn Maul's torso as he stumbled back, and she lifted into the air before diving down and rolling across the ground, igniting the saber again over her leg that was laid out across the floor. She looked up to Maul, who spun his saber aggressively and readied it. Satine moved up to match him, using both her shield and saber for her attack. They collided this time for real, which again proved to Maul that Satine was playing mental games with him. She came here using every single trick a Mandalorian could use so that she could find herself a victory. Their blades connected, bashing across each other, but there was something that must be said about the Duchess's and the Duke's old armor. It was covered mostly everywhere. It was true battle armor, one for a leader who could fight off the oppressors, which her father used to do. Maul drove the weapon down, where she used her elbow to defend the strike, allowing the pure Beskar to protect her. She spun around, kicking her leg out and crushing his jaw, as he funneled all of his rage into this fight. No more games, no more hunting the incapable prey. This was a warrior who had used his own arrogance as a tool for her own power. The darksaber twisted in her hand as she readied herself, looking for anywhere to seize the advantage. She flipped the weapon around, defending herself, and using the grapple to jab into one of his legs as she spun down under his strike and moved up around him, light on the balls of her feet, before attaching the other side of the grapple to his shoulder. Satine backed away as Maul tripped over himself. Her moment to seize victory was right here, right now. As she raised the darksaber, Maul decided he had enough of this game, and he would cheat his way to victory, using the Force to choke her, lifting her off of the ground as he snapped the grapple from his shoulder and his leg, before igniting his own saber one final time and stepping towards her. He used the Force to toss the Mandalorian weapon off of her head, and instead of fear, there was certainty. But before he could move another step forward, he was stopped. His ability to use the Force slowly drained from his body, as his grip on the Duchess slipped out from under his hands. He tried to do anything, but without constant control, he was turned slowly around as a shadowy figure dropped down to the ground with a heavy thud. A metallic hand raised out from the hood, and Skywalker's scowl grew from under the shadow of his own hood. He shoved Maul to his knees and closed his eyes, reaching out his other hand and stripping the Force as a whole from Maul. Anakin understood that to these Sith, their power was everything. So to Maul, he no longer had his power, his Force, or what made him special in any way. Anakin released his Force choke and shoved Maul onto his back, with another shockwave. He looked over to the other Mandalorians who readied themselves to fight, and he raised his hands, looking to each of them, and asking if they wanted a fair fight. If not, there'd be a lot more dead bodies in this room other than Maul's. They all looked over to Maul, who stumbled over himself. His metallic legs weighed him down, and he could barely move. He looked over to Satine, who got up with ease, twisting her neck and shrugging her shoulders. Anakin watched the warrior step up to Maul. The Sith tried to do anything. He reached for his saber and tried to pull it, but there was no pull. He tried to reach out and fell over himself, trying to pull his heavy legs with anything. He finally got some movement as Satine watched him like a prey. Maul tripped into his lightsaber, where he firmly grabbed it and got up, to his feet, looking at Anakin to make sure he wasn't doing anything else, and then to Satine, who watched him. Maul's face no longer held certainty. It was fearful, and he was terrified, but that terror had made him strong as a warrior. He swung aggressively at her. While his legs may have been inoperable, his torso wasn't. But there was very little movement to go around for Maul, as he tried to maintain his position, but he realistically couldn't, not with his legs being inoperable. Satine was able to, after a quick back and forth, cut his legs out from under him, and kick him down. Maul crawled away like a child, and she raised the darksaber and said the words, "For Mandalore," as she slammed the darksaber through Maul's back before ripping it out and decapitating the Zabrak warrior. Anakin wore more shock on his face than anyone else. Everyone around him got to their knees, as their ruler had just been identified. Satine raised the head of Maul off the ground and held it for all of them to see. She told them all that this was the last time any single one of them dare question her rule as leader of Mandalore. Her eyes firmed, and she told them to go out, unify with the Night Owls, and destroy every sign of the criminal organizations on the landing docks. Their kind were not welcome in Mandalore. At the same time, she told another to rally the people because she had a speech to make. The head of Maul dropped and rolled across the ground, as she turned to her father's helmet and picked it up with grief written across her face. She apologized to Anakin under her breath as he stepped forward, asking why. She told him that she understood how important Obi Wan was to him. She couldn't afford Mandalore to fall under Republic jurisdiction, especially not during the Clone War. She got up and thanked him for having been here though, as she asked if the Council sent him, and well, that wasn't really the case. Anakin had sent Rex to Mandalore to do some undercover work, and learned about the Clan Kryze symbols. Skywalker had gone to the Outer Rim sieges with his fleet to make sure everything was quote-unquote going soundly. His student was actually maintaining fleet operations at the current moment. He instead came here and had been tracking Satine for days. This was not a council mandate. For the same reason, she did not want him to join her. The Republic was not going to interfere in a local event for a planet not within the Republic. She patted his shoulder and asked that she join him. She led him through the palace and into her own chambers, where she pulled from her mantle a kyber crystal. She turned back and placed it into Anakin's hands, and told him that when Obi Wan left Mandalore for the first time, he entrusted his Padawan crystal to her. Satine told Anakin that it was his to have. He tried to reject it, but she insisted. This was not a mere choice, but something she was forcing him to accept. She had closed the chapter with Obi Wan Kenobi, and while it didn't end the way she would have liked it to, it did end with Qui-Gon's killer and even Obi-Wan's killer left as a sign of the changing times. She told Anakin that he was the Jedi Master now, placing her hand on his shoulder, telling him to always remember who Obi-Wan was, to pass on his lessons, his compassion, and his love onto those he trains in his own life. Anakin smiled, knowing that Ahsoka carried such attributes. She told Skywalker that she must excuse herself. Mandalore was going to become hers once more. Satine stepped away as Anakin looked down, and felt the kyber crystal. The presence was much like himself. Young, eager, a little arrogant, but fiercely loyal, kind, and loving. It was an Obi-Wan he never truly got to know because of Qui-Gon's death, and it was an Obi-Wan he planned to dedicate his life to. He would return to Coruscant, where he would learn that Padme was now pregnant. Due to him being on the High Council, the timing of such arrangements were never made appropriately. The soon-to-be twins would be born in the post-Clone War era. Satine, on the other hand, would raise the head of Maul over Sundari City, from her tower at the back of the palace. She would unveil a plan set in place by Pre Vizsla, one to make her look as bad as possible, and how she never stopped fighting for them. She continued to fight for them, as she had dedicated her life to Mandalore. Satine promised everyone who looked up to her that she would fight for them until her last breath. But now it was time for them to begin the hard work. It was time to mesh tradition with modernity. It was time to forge a new future, because the neutral systems still had power, and she was returning to lead Mandalore and the Coalition in the new era. The following few years would include great change, but none greater than that of Mandalore's. A new training academy would be started on the Concordia moon. Mandalore would offer its first child over to the Jedi Order in centuries, and the planet itself was the center of a coalition that demanded excellence from the Reformed Republic. If Satine had died, the coalition would have fallen apart under Palpatine, but the singular hope that she had survived was what determined the fate of the Neutral Systems Coalition. Her decisions impacted the lives of billions, and now at her control over it all, she planned on fighting for the people of the Coalition and the people of the galaxy. They didn't become adversaries to the Republic, but they challenged it. Their trade routes and their control over impossibly large neutral territory meant that their goods and supplies would need to be traded into the Republic. In exchange, Satine and her systems forced the will of the powerful government to focus more on its outreach. On Mandalore, Prime Minister Almec would remain imprisoned. Gar Saxon would challenge for the Darksaber and lose, and on top of all of it, sisters would be reunited. Bo never got a chance to see Maul's death, but she and Satine would make up for the time they lost, and become true family members again. It would of course be revealed to Corky that his mother was indeed Satine, which meant the lineage of Clan Kryze had an heir. Into Satine's family was also the addition of Anakin and his secret family. Padme was already a close friend, so no-brainer there. But for Satine and Anakin, they were bonded through loss. Their friendship would remain a key reason why Mandalorian Jedi were a fact of the future. Master Skywalker would never leave the Council, and continue to maintain a good reputation within the ranks of the Jedi Order. No one would ever learn of his secret family. Satine's Mandalore would remain strong and prosperous. While her speech with Maul's head wasn't who she was at her core, it sent a message that identified the sacrifices she was willing to make to remain their leader, to protect their people and maintain their peace. Satine Kryze would be remembered as the unifier, the one Mandalorian to unite the factions and save their people from total civil war again. Mandalore's influence, like Satine's, would remain a positive one for generations to come. And that, my friends, is our story. And special thanks to all our patrons: Sir Wells, Darth Maelstrom, Ozpin, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Brood36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, Angel Dust, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Jango Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tib, CC2024, Gallivan Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granite D. Bane, Laliat, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlinger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewa670, Anakin Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny Naguin, Sense Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Callie, Youngling Slayer 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Fortis Lakes of Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, the Man with 3 First Names, Darkseid46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Giveaway down below, 140, we're approaching it, should be coming up soon. Get them Star Destroyers, I want to give them away. Let's talk about this story. So yeah, that's that. I had a lot of fun with this one, but it was really challenging trying to figure out how to balance the stories of Anakin and Satine, because I think it's a story about Satine at its core, but there's like a B plot going on with Anakin, and it was a little hard and challenging to balance those two, but I think it works out pretty well here, where you get Anakin's side story, which goes through the temple bombing arc and all that stuff, while you go through Satine's journey through refining her Mandalorian roots. I believe firmly that she was trained as a Mandalorian by her father and just decided to go against it after her father died during the war. I think it makes a lot of sense for her to be a naturally trained Mandalorian. As Bo talks about in Mandalorian Season 3, they did all the traditional stuff, so I don't doubt that Satine went through that until she was like 15, 16 years old. So all that stuff is muscle memory just sitting there, and I think it would work. I don't think she would win against Maul head-on. That's why Anakin removes his ability to use the Force, but I think she could outsmart him, and I think at the end of the day, fighting Maul is about outsmarting him. His biggest losses always come when someone outsmarts him. Obi Wan beats him twice because of that. So, I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.